Tariffs are often touted as tools of patriotism, but what if they're simply misguided policies that end up hurting the very people they claim to protect? In this episode of China in the News, conversation with Professor Doug Guthrie, we'll dissect the recently imposed 10% additional tariffs on China, explore Beijing's retaliation, and analyze who truly bears the cost of these measures. Are tariffs a bold strategy or economic misstep? Professor, what is the rationale behind imposing the 10% tariffs on China while setting 25% tariff rate on Mexico and Canada?
So it's great to be with you again, Christina. I love our conversations, and this is such an important time to be talking about the really important topics. So your setup kind of gives us a signal as to what part of the logic might be here. So this 10% tariffs on China is an additional 10%. So our participants or our listeners will remember that going back to 2018, then President Trump set in motion 25% tariffs that were pretty much across the board for a number of different products. There were some targets in it, but it was, pretty wide sweeping tariffs for a lot of different products. Okay. Now, this got a little confusing because the Trump administration's, as they were running for this election, talked about 60% tariffs, and there was a lot of bluster about big numbers. But those 25% tariffs are still in place. And so this 10% tariffs is an additional 10%. So even though it looks like it's smaller than the tariffs that are being set in place for Mexico and Canada, this is going to net make the Chinese tariffs about 35% for many different products across the board. And so I think that's the logic of why, I think they've come down from the crazy blustery trade war of 60% and now are just putting an additional 10% in place for China.
Thank you. Well, did the Mexican president and Canadian prime minister manage to negotiate a 30-day delay from the U.S.? Mexico committed to deploy 10,000 National Guard troops to their northern border to address concern about drug trafficking and illegal immigration. Similarly, Canada agreed to enhance border security and also appointing a fentanyl czar. But the funny thing is, these commitments are actions that were already in progress. Effectively, both leaders played President Trump without making substantial new concessions. Doesn't this mean the strategy of imposing tariffs on our two closest allies simply didn't work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing though, because you're talking about this at the nuanced level, and so when you're thinking about this just as somebody who's an outsider who isn't following so closely what's the sort of history of the tariff and history of negotiations and history of diplomacy of uh, Mexico and the United States, Canada and the United States, it might look like the blustery Donald Trump thinks that he got what he wanted because immediately it was announced that the Mexican president was sending 10,000 troops to the border. And, Canada, as you mentioned, was doing things like talking about a fentanyl czar and, thinking about different ways to really help at the border crossing issues. But to your point, these were already in play. Like this stuff was already happening under the Biden administration. It just is these two the president and the prime minister have affirmed that they will continue doing what they're doing. And the Trump administration handlers, I think, are playing this as if he got something out of them. But, they didn't get anything. Like basically, we've sort of dialed down the rhetoric so it doesn't immediately look like there's going to be a trade war and Canada and Mexico are going to fight back. But they're just doing exactly what they said they did. And then the Trump administration put the tariffs on hold. And so, it does look to me like, there was a lot of muscle flexing to show that we could be the strong arm of these trade dynamics. But essentially, these two leaders just agreed to continue doing what they were doing, and the Trump administration backed down.
Traditionally, what are tariffs used for? Do we have any evidence that tariffs actually achieve their intended economic goals?
Well, so just to really kind of go deeper into what they're traditionally used for, I mean, the very issue is that tariffs increase prices at the border for goods that are imported from a given country, for example. Now, you and I have talked about this before, but I want to reiterate for our listeners. When President Trump or J.D. Vance or anybody says this is a tax on China, that is simply incorrect. And, I think these people have smart economic advisors and they're intelligent people, so they know that it's not correct. But it's fits with the sort of blustery uh, notion that the reason we're hurting in the United States, or the reason we don't have a good manufacturing supply chain, is because China has stolen our jobs, or people from Mexico are crossing the border and stealing our jobs. Um, the very concept of tariffs, however, are they're not a tax on the country. They are a tax on imported goods that are coming from that country. Okay. And that tax is almost always passed on to the consumer, right? So what tariffs do is they raise prices for products that are purchased when they're exported from, say, China to the United States. Now, the logic of it is that if you have a product that costs X, and then with the tariff it costs 25X plus 25% of X, um, then it's going to be more expensive, that good. And then people might think, well, since that iPhone is 25% more expensive, maybe I'll buy an American-made product. And because the price is now higher of the imported product, and so it might have price equalization. And then if you buy the American-made product, you'll in effect be supporting the manufacturing supply chain in America and therefore supporting jobs in America. And thus it helps and boost the economy because the imported tariff gave people incentives to buy local. The problem with that is that for that to work, there must be a manufacturing supply chain in the United States such that people can choose to buy the American-made good. But for example, with iPhones, there is no manufacturing supply chain for iPhones. iPhones are not made in America, and so if you have higher prices of iPhones and people want to buy an iPhone, it's just going to be the iPhone is going to be 25% more expensive. Now, here again, if the argument was, well, if the iPhone's more expensive, then people will buy the American-made good. But you know, there are very few American-made goods that are in the same category as iPhone or Apple computers. And so there is no choice that supports manufacturing jobs. Now, there are certain industries where this does work. And so I would just remind our listeners of the Biden tariffs that really made sense were the tariffs on electric vehicles, which increased the price of, say, BYD goods. And the reason these made sense is because if you increase the price at the border of goods made by BYD, that's going to induce people to buy Tesla. And Tesla does have a vertically integrated manufacturing supply chain in America, such that even though they're relatively expensive cars, if you increase the price of BYD cars at the border, then people might think, okay, well, I'm going to buy a Tesla and thus support jobs in America. But you have to have the manufacturing supply chain in the country in order for the tariffs to work.
In fact, I read that certain car parts would actually cross US-Mexico border up to 8 times before final assembly. That means that part is actually subject to tariff 8 times.
Correct.
So this is shocking.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about this. Using tariff to address drug trafficking and immigration issues rather than trade concerns seems quite unconventional. So do you think this is a innovative approach on the White House or a really misguided strategy?
I'm 100% on the misguided strategy side of things. Tariffs are an economic tool. And again, we just talked about the logic of these, and they were meant to increase prices that are at the border for imported goods from other countries. And those prices are almost always, if not always, passed on to consumers. Um, but they are a trade-oriented good, or a trade-oriented tool that allows you to tinker with prices such that you can push people to buy locally made goods. They are not a diplomatic tool, or that at least they shouldn't be. I think the Trump administration is trying to use them as a diplomatic tool to do things like penalize the Mexican economy and the Mexican president and to penalize Canadian and Prime Minister Trudeau to force them to do things that we should be talking to them about doing at the negotiating table, right? And as we discussed in the earlier question, they were already in the process of doing these things because they had been at the negotiating table with President Biden. And so, the idea that you would just use a tariff as a cudgel to just beat your allies into doing what you want them to do, I just think is terrible diplomacy and is a very misguided strategy.
President Trump has been in the office for only 2 weeks, and his approach seems to prioritize American interests above all else. In responding to the tariffs, Canada and Mexico emphasized their long-standing alliances with US. How might this situation impact our diplomatic relations with these two countries?
I mean, I think it's a disaster for diplomatic relations because, again, I think important, complex problems require careful diplomatic conversations. And sometimes you have to sit down and have difficult conversations with your allies. But, you do those through negotiation and through diplomacy and through kind of careful conversations and agreements that you reach. Um, but again, to use tariffs as just a cudgel to beat your allies into submission and force them to do things that you want to do, it's misguided because it doesn't, it didn't work. I mean, we were about to get into a trade war with Canada. As there was threats that, okay, so we're going to do things like take liquor from red states off the shelf. And
No more bourbon
yeah,
in Canada.
yeah. And we have a lot of border crossings, as you mentioned, in both Canada and Mexico of complex manufacturing supply chains where parts for automobiles for the big three are moving across the border 8 times, you said. And so, I just think that this is a bad approach to how to do diplomacy, and it just makes our allies trust us less. I think it makes them think that we're just out of it. We're silly. And so I just think it's bad diplomacy.
Well, China has taken a different approach to these tariffs from Mexico and Canada, choosing to announce its own retaliatory tariffs in response and not seeking a quick diplomatic compromise. Why the difference?
Well, I think there are a couple of things here. First of all, China is in a much more powerful position in sort of the balance of trade than most people realize. Um, yes, they were up until not too long ago our largest trading partner, and now they're our second largest trading partner behind Mexico. They're also the second largest economy in the world, um, but they also are home to the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. And as you and I have discussed previously, companies like Tesla and Apple are very, very closely wedded to China, and there is no alternative. I mean, Tesla is a little bit different than Apple because Tesla actually does have a vertically integrated manufacturing supply chain in America, but they are also hugely positioned in China with their gigafactory and the suppliers that they rely on. Apple is tremendously dependent on China. And again, people often talk about things like, well, Foxconn is in Chennai, iPhones can be made there. But that's just final assembly. Apple, it depends on more than 1,000, maybe more than 1,500 Chinese suppliers to provide the kinds of components at competitive prices that they need. And so I think that China knows that it's in a very, very powerful position and can hurt the U.S. economy significantly. And so, why bow down to Donald Trump? Like, you want to give us tariffs? We'll put some back on you. The other thing that's really important here, I think, is it's important to remember, and I've had this conversation with you before, but I want to just remind our listeners that, you know, China is a very proud nation, and Xi Jinping is a very proud leader. There was a long period called the Century of Humiliation, in which China really felt like it had sort of fallen behind in the world. And then after the Communist Revolution and the rise of Mao, there was still just a terrible situation and 300 million people living in abject poverty. And then Deng Xiaoping came to meet Jimmy Carter in 1979, and the doors opened and we started to develop. And over the last 45 years, China has just seen tremendous development to become the second largest economy in the world. And as you've heard me say, I believe within 10 years, they will be the largest economy in the world. But they want to be treated as partners, right? And we've talked about this before with the G7 versus the G20, right? China
The
doesn't have,
kids' table.
yeah, China doesn't have a seat at the adults table, which is the G7. They're at the kids table, the G20. And I know a lot of Chinese officials who just find this disgusting. And so I think that they're in a position where they can sort of retaliate and both economies will be hurt, but it's going to be okay. And if they want to have if President Trump wants to have a conversation, I think President Xi will say, like, let's have a respectful conversation and let's get into it. But until we do that, if you're going to put tariffs on us, we're going to put them on you.
Well, China already announced a counter tariff that it would impose 15% tariff on coal and liquefied natural gas products such as well as 10% tariff on crude oil, agricultural machinery, and large engine cars imported from the US. So that's happening. So let's talk about this. If they're already retaliating against US tariffs, what does it mean for the broader US China relationship?
Well, and harkening back to what we were just talking about a few minutes ago about tariffs and diplomacy and the U.S. China, U.S. or U.S. Mexico, U.S. Canada relationship, I just think it's bad diplomacy. This is not the way. Economies are complicated, and especially intertwined economies like the United States and China are, in complicated dynamics in a dance. And so, if you just want to, hit your fist on the table and say we're having tariffs and we're, going to increase the prices of Chinese goods coming in. They can do the same to us, and it's bad diplomacy. But here again, there are a lot of different ways that our economies are intertwined. So this could end up not just hurting Apple, but then Walmart, the single largest exporter from China to the United States. But it also could, just if you start to look at things like crude oil or coal or a number of different things, the flow of goods that are related to energy, um, then things get really complicated really quickly. And so here again, I just think it's really important to have respectful diplomatic relations. Doesn't mean we have to roll over and just say everything China is doing is perfect and we don't have any diplomatic say in what's happening. But tariffs are such a blunt instrument that I just think it's going to make U.S.-China relations worse. And then I think again to come back to the issue we were just talking about the G7 and the kids table, I think this is just going to make China continue to pivot away from the United States. I think as we're seeing things like the Belt and Road Initiative and the reinvigoration of BRICS, I think China's laying the groundwork for saying, you know what, we are in a different position and we're going to start to move away from our trade relation with the United States. So one other thing, Christine, that you and I have talked about before that's so important is China controls about, I think the number we've discussed before is about 90% of the refinement of rare earths in the world. And a lot of those rare earths are in the direction of places like sub-Saharan Africa, where the Belt and Road Initiative is being built, where we were withdrawing USAID money, and China is getting ready to go right into the vacuum that's left behind. And so I think this is a very dangerous path to go down for the U.S. economy and for U.S. diplomatic relations.
That's very disappointing. Yeah, also, actually, on Tuesday, February 4th, China announced sweeping export control and the decision to restrict tungsten and indium, among other metals, is also their latest attempt to weaponize their dominance in mining and processing of critical minerals. So, so overall, you talked about the global supply chain and how might this escalating trade war affect the economy of United States and China?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is it's really important to reiterate this fact. And, President Trump and Vice President Vance have said it many times on the campaign trail that, you know, this is not going to hurt. This is a tax on China. It's not going to hurt U.S. consumers. They're simply lying. It is. This will increase inflation when you pass prices on down to consumers, which all companies will do. Apple is not going to pay the extra 25% and eat that cost, right? That money is going to get passed on to consumers. Same with Walmart. Again, Tesla's in a bit of a different situation because most of their things made in China go to Europe. But, there's just complex aspects of the tariffs for U.S.-China relations, but also if we continue with this path with Mexico and Canada. And so first of all, their promise to reduce costs and reduce inflation, tariffs aren't going to help that at all. And by the way, I talked about the big, you know, heavy industry goods and, things like complex manufacturing, but food is a big thing here too, right? And so is oil. We are going to see gas prices go up, if the Canadian tariffs continue to be set in place 30 days from now. And so it's going to hurt consumers. It's going to increase inflation. And it's not going to do the core thing that tariffs are meant to do, which is this is not going to help us rebuild manufacturing supply chains in America. The only way to do that is to work in a coordinated partnership fashion, one with states, and help them build manufacturing supply chains in places like Arizona, where TSMC has invested $65 billion. And, there's seed funding from the Biden administration of $6.5 million because of the CHIPS Act. And it would be great for Arizona to see lots more Chinese investment flowing into the United States and places like Arizona to build those manufacturing supply chains. But a trade war and tariffs are not going to incentivize companies to do that. They're going to start to look elsewhere, and they're going to look at the Chinese pivot away with the BRICS and look at places like India and other parts of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so I just think this is a loser for the economy for sure. It's bad.
I find it ridiculous that Trump and his cronies seems to be preparing the world to accept higher grocery and good prices and call that patriotism. And this is what Fox News has been brainwashing. Um,
Brainwashing is a good word.
yeah. Well, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, thank you for asking, Christine. I just think, as you know, I think this is such a critical time for U.S.-China relations, and I think, we are in spaces of just the difficulty that we've been in for, haven't seen for 30 years. And, I have been hopeful that things were going to get better. And, there was part of me after President Trump got elected that I was thinking, well, these guys are business people, and, they're going to be smart about this because they're talking about making life better for consumers and investing in manufacturing to help economies grow. But it seems like the only person that's fundamentally economically self-interested here is Elon Musk, and he's just economically self-interested for his own interests more than anything. And so, if there are economic incentives here, uh, having Musk in play, I do think, pushes us towards President Trump. We've got to negotiate with China. We've got to. But just using these heavy hammer of tariffs and flexing your muscles and making it look like we're the ones in control, I just think it's not the way economic development should happen. I think it's not the way diplomacy should happen. And so I'm very nervous, Christine. I think this is a very, very difficult time. And so I think we want everybody to come to the table and just continue to put pressure on the politicians to be good diplomats, but then also continue to help the process of economic development in places like Arizona and many other states across the country that could use the investment from economic partnership with China.
Thank you. Well, that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to China in the News with Professor Guthrie. If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover in the future, let us know in the comment. Our next episode will be covering Panama Canal, what I call a geopolitical pawn. Until next time, stay tuned. Stay informed. Bye-bye.